Ladies and gentlemen, President Richard Nixon, June 17th, 1971.
As I talked to the people from New York State, I realized the need for money to deal with this problem. I am glad that in this administration we have increased the amount of money for handling the problem of dangerous drugs sevenfold. It will be $600 million this year. More money will be needed in the future. I want to say, however, that despite our budget problems, to the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spend. Take another look now and take some time for hemp. I don't cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yeah, it's time for hemp. Whoa, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rent. Well, right now it's time for hemp.
Thank you for taking time for hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leach. You are listening to the Time for Hemp Today podcast. And on the Time for Hemp Today podcast, we feature hardworking activists from all around the world and a little bit of music. We open the program today with the words of Richard Milhous Nixon 40 years ago when he officially declared war on drugs. Since that time, $1 trillion or more and millions of lives ruined, and a political consensus is emerging that the war on drugs is a counterproductive failure. The Drug Policy Alliance is leading advocates all across the country in marking this auspicious date with a day of action to raise awareness about the catastrophic failure of drug prohibition and to call for an exit strategy from the failed war on drugs. Some anniversaries provide an occasion for celebration, others a time for reflection, still others a time for action, said Ethan Nadelmann, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. He is the focus of today's podcast. He is a guest on Time for Hemp on a regular basis, and we have him on the show today. Joint hosting that segment will be Paul Stanford. But before Ethan and Paul and I sit down and talk, we're going to be focusing on an exciting event that did occur on, I think it was June 2nd. To be honest, it was kind of weird. I was up in Toronto. I had just arrived. The Treating Yourself EXPO was due to start the next day on the 3rd. And the Treating Yourself EXPO, I must say, I've got to stop right here and say it was a world-class exhibition of marijuana companies, hemp activists, and the remarkable way that this plant can change the world. Truly a world-class display of farming, of advanced scientific studies in medicine, a great array of speakers, marvelous music, hosted by Marco Randa of Treating Yourself Journal. Marco is the gentleman of the marijuana movement, and anybody who's looking for a wonderful way to spend their time. If you only have one vacation a year, I would encourage you to mark your calendar for the Treating Yourself Expo. It is an annual event. And as I rolled into Toronto, and after I had been celebrating the upcoming day's festivities with the wonderful family of friends that I have up in Canada, I was back in my hotel room channel surfing, and I suddenly saw a friend of mine, Ethan Nadelmann, on global television on the BBC, and he was talking about this group of people that had gotten together, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and it was really exciting. It was a group of people like Richard Branson, who owns, I think, the Virgin Group airline company, and former presidents of Brazil and Colombia and Mexico and Switzerland, representatives from the United States such as George Shultz and Paul Volcker and John Whitehead. Really an amazing group of people had gotten together, and you know what they had concluded? That the war on drugs was a dismal failure. We're going to be listening to Ethan talk about that on Washington Journal, I believe it is, and then we're going to have him on as a guest on Time for Hemp. Joint hosting that segment will be Paul Stanford. We've also got other news comments from around the world pertaining to this particular historic gathering of amazing minds. So if you and your friends are looking for some actual scientific studies and some amazing findings of well-researched aspects pertaining to the war on drugs by learned people, this segment is a segment that you need to turn into when you sit down and take with your friends Time for Hemp.
Washington Journal continues.
Joining us from New York is Ethan Nadelmann. He's the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. And Mr. Nadelmann, we bring you on to talk about a report that came out recently. It was a report looking at, I guess, a global sense of what is known as the drug war. Could you give us the genesis of this report and the findings?
Yes, I mean, it's really a quite remarkable development in terms of global drug policy. What happened essentially is that a number of very distinguished former presidents from Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico enlisted others. The former president of Switzerland, the former security minister of the European Union, George Shultz, the former secretary of, I guess, everything in the United States, Paul Volcker, Richard Branson, the businessman, and many others, and they came out with a report that was devastating in its critique of U.S. and global drug control policy. They said that reliance on prohibitionist laws and on criminal justice institutions has generated an enormous disaster, vast black markets, empowered organized criminals, result in the spread of disease and addiction rather than impeding it. And they called for a paradigm shift in the way that we deal with drugs around the world. They said that addiction must be treated as a health issue, that people who use drugs and don't hurt anybody else should essentially be left alone. They said we need new law enforcement strategies with regard to organized crime that focus on reducing their power and intimidation rather than necessarily drug markets. And also, quite importantly, they said that there must be support for experiments in legally regulating drugs, especially marijuana. But even with others, they said, let's not just close our eyes to the notion of legal regulation. Let's try to find intelligent ways to regulate these drugs so that we can reduce both the harms of drug prohibition and the harms of drug abuse.
As you see it, then, what evidence is there that legal regulation of drugs would lead to the results that this group of people wanted to see?
Well, there's two pieces of evidence. The first is the obvious failure of the current approach. I mean, when you see that the amount of drug abuse around the world, HIV, overdose fatalities, either is sustained or keeps growing, you see the failure. When you see the violence today in Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean, when you see it in Africa, which is what motivated Kofi Annan to join the Commission, you see the failure of this strategy. In so many respects, it's like what happened with alcohol prohibition, right? I mean, that was a period when we criminalized a popular use drug, alcohol, in the hope that we could eliminate alcohol problems. And in fact, the results were no significant diminution in alcohol use, but the emergence of organized crime, violence, corruption, overflowing prison cells, and what have you. The second piece of evidence is that when you look at those countries that have decriminalized, not really legalized, but decriminalized the possession of drugs, have stopped throwing people in jail for drugs, places in Portugal or Switzerland or other parts of Europe, what you see is that there are no increases in drug use as a result of those policies, but you do have decreases in overdose fatalities, in new HIV and Hep C infections, in arrests, the number of people going to prison, what have you. So moderate measures that decriminalize drug use appear to have relatively few risks and significant benefits. As for broader legalization, well, one looks at the experience of post-alcohol prohibition. You know, the amount of alcohol being consumed did go up, but we took a major source of revenue for organized crime away. When you look at the situation in the Netherlands, where they basically have more or less regulated the cannabis situation for over 30 years, and their levels of marijuana use are less than they are here. So I think people are afraid of the alternatives. People know that the drug war is not working. They know it can't work on some level. They're afraid of what the alternative should be. And this commission comes along of some of the most distinguished people really around the world, and they say, we need to lose some of our fears. We need to break the taboo and open debate and dialogue. We need to at least experiment with alternative approaches.
So if you want to ask our guest questions about this report, and the findings that were done as far as the drug war as it's known in a global sense, 3 lines set up. You can send us email if you wish, and we'll read as many of those as we can in our time. We start with Fort Wayne, Indiana on our Republican line. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call. I do appreciate it. I agree with your guest there. I think it's an absolute Neanderthal thinking that some sort of a law will prevent a person from doing something that they choose to do. I believe in liberty. I believe in freedom and responsibility. I think that you shouldn't put a person in jail if they're doing heroin or they're doing cocaine or they're drinking alcohol, as long as they don't endanger somebody else's life while they're doing it. I think if you legalize everything from prostitution to drugs and everything else, you legalize it, you tax it, you inspect it, and you leave people to their own druthers, to their own choices, we'd have a lot less problems. And the guest was absolutely right. And the whole idea of when they asked Ron Paul about legalizing drugs, they said, well, wouldn't that make a person do heroin? He goes, well, I don't need a government to tell me not to do it, to not make that choice.
And Mr. Nadelmann, is it as simple as that? Legalize everything and the problems go away?
Well, you know, I'll tell you, it's not quite as simple as that, and the Global Commission did not call for legalizing all drugs, but I basically agree with the sentiments of your caller. I mean, you know, we do have to treat different drugs differently. We treat alcohol and cigarettes differently. Marijuana and cocaine would need to be treated differently if they were legally regulated. I think the policy of treating them all the same and throwing everybody in jail or prison for using or possessing or making or selling or buying these things, irrespective of whether or not they're doing any harm to anybody else, I mean, as your caller said, that is ludicrous, and in many respects, it violates some of the principles that Americans hold dearest. I think what's important to realize also is that when it comes to marijuana, most Americans don't like the idea of legally regulating heroin or cocaine, at least not yet. But when it comes to marijuana, we've seen a dramatic movement in public opinion in the last few years. The Gallup poll has been asking the same question for about 40 years, which is, do you favor legalizing marijuana use? Back in 2005, 36% of Americans said yes, which was the highest ever, and 60% were opposed. 5 years later, as of last fall, the end of 2010, that 36% in favor of legalizing marijuana had become 46%. That 60% against had become 50% against. A 24-point gap had become a 4-point gap in opinion, and you now see a majority in favor in some of the western states, a majority in favor among Democrats, a majority in favor among Americans under the age of 30. So I think it's not inevitable that we're going to move in that direction, but it certainly seems to be the case that we're going to see a few states in the United States deciding to try to legally regulate marijuana rather than persist with these ineffective prohibitions sometime in the next 2 to 6 years.
You talk about the state level. Jim Hines off of Twitter this morning wants to ask you if the report has any chance of coming to anything policy-wise. Let's take it on the federal level.
Well, I'll tell you, I was at a gathering with a number of members of Congress just yesterday, and one or two of them came up to me and they said, I saw all that information about the Global Commission. That's great work. I think I want to do something again on this thing. And so my response is to focus them sometimes on what they might be able to do locally in their own jurisdictions. There were congressmen from New York where we have a terrible problem. New York City is the marijuana arrest capital of the world. We're arresting 50,000 people a year for marijuana. Simple possession, having it in your pocket, while Mayor Bloomberg admitted that he once smoked marijuana and liked it. So, you know, I'm asking congressmen if they can help with that sort of issue, even though it's a local issue. So there will be some movement. I just got an email this morning from Israel where they say the Knesset's going to take up this debate because of this issue. This Global Commission report was on the front pages of Norway, the front pages in England and France. It was in Mexico, Colombia. It stirred up debate in Australia. So I think we're going to see this debate popping up around the country. And I think in Congress, you're going to see a growing number of congressmen, both on the Democratic side, Ron Paul on the right, and maybe some new voices beginning to pop up saying we need a new way.
Woodbridge, Virginia is next. Kevin on our independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing? I have a question. What would happen if we legalize drugs? I'm going to tell you. If we legalize drugs, attorneys would lose their jobs, probation officers would lose their jobs, lawyers would lose their jobs, prisons would close down. My question to you is, how is it that so much drugs gets into this country? You know, I was I think a while back in California, I was informed that the CIA was bringing a lot of drugs into this country, cocaine, and there have been movies about the government bringing drugs in this country. If we get rid of drugs, people will lose their jobs. How do you feel about this?
Well, I'll tell you, you raise a good point at the start. Let me just say, with respect to keeping drugs out of the country, that's impossible. I mean, when we're talking about marijuana, cocaine, or heroin, as with alcohol, cigarettes, and other things, these are basically global commodities. They can be produced in many parts of the world. It is impossible to keep them out of the United States. All of the drugs being consumed in the United States or imported in the United States take up something like 0.00001% of all the goods coming into the United States each year. It is impossible to stop that. If there were a demand in the United States for 10 times as much heroin as there is today, those drugs would come in. If there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. That said, where you started off with your point, and by the way, you're right about the CIA. They've been involved in the drug business over the years, but even if the CIA had been totally squeaky clean, even if they had not gotten involved in drug markets in Southeast Asia or Afghanistan or South America because they were working with anti-communist forces, the drugs still would have come into the country. But your starting point, I think, was really profound, which is that we now have a prison industrial complex in America. You know, our prison industrial complex has grown at a dramatic pace. We've increased the number of Americans behind bars from 500,000 in 1980 to 2.3 million today. Today, the United States, with less than 5% of the world's population, has almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We rank first in the world, both in absolute incarceration and per capita incarceration. Millions of people are employed in this business, and nothing's driving it so much as the war on drugs. We've increased tenfold the number of people locked up on drug charges since 1980, from 50,000 to 500,000. We lock up more people in America on drug charges today than all of Western Europe locks up for everything, and they have 100 million more people than we do. So you're right. You got prison guards union and private prison builders. You have prosecutors and you got police departments. Now, my view is, even if we land up legalizing marijuana and possibly other drugs as well, there's still other crime that they can deal with. The prisons won't be so filled, the courthouses won't be so filled, some people won't have the same jobs they used to, but there's other crime out there that maybe the government should be paying attention to instead of this.
Mr. Nadelmann, Gil Kurlikowski weighed in on the report in an op-ed that he had on the Hill, and this is only a portion of what he said, but let me read it to you. He's the White House Office Director of National Drug Control Policy. He said, despite the Commission's assertions, efforts to reduce drug use over the last several decades have, in fact, achieved success. Overall drug use in the United States is half of what it was 30 years ago. Cocaine production in Colombia has dropped by almost 2/3. And the very same UN World Drug Report cited by the Commission concluded that, quote, demand for cocaine in the U.S. has been in long-term decline. How would you respond to that?
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, there's really two things wrong with what Gil Kurlikowski is saying. The first thing, of course, is that he's entirely ignoring the fact that we now have 500,000 people behind bars, that we're spending something like $75 billion a year on the drug war that could be better spent in other areas. He's ignoring the horrible crime and violence corruption that's spreading around the world, from Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, Africa, Afghanistan, you name it. In other words, he's ignoring all of the horrific negative consequences of the drug war. Secondly, he's ignoring the fact that we cut cigarette consumption in this country more dramatically than we cut illicit drug use in the last few decades, and that we did that without relying on criminal laws. So part of what's driving down the number of people using drugs is not a war on drugs, it's not the criminalization of drugs, it's pragmatic, sensible public health policies, it's sensible tax and regulatory policies and what have you. But the last and really fatal problem with what Mr. Kurlikowski is saying is that he's got the wrong bottom line. Because what's really important is not how many Americans said yes to some pollster, yes, I used marijuana, or yes, I used cocaine last year. You know, by that measure, 1980 was the worst of all years because 40 million Americans said that they had used cocaine or marijuana in the past year. Now, mind you, most of them did not have a problem with marijuana or cocaine. Most of them were yuppies or whatever. A relatively small percent got involved in addiction. Now, Gil Kurlikowski would say 1980 was the worst of all years because so many Americans were using drugs, illicit drugs. 10 years later, in 1990, the number of Americans using illicit drugs had dropped significantly, and all the drug warriors claimed success. But you know what's interesting when you compare 1980 and 1990? In 1980, nobody had ever heard of crack cocaine. 1990, fewer people were using cocaine, but we had a national crack epidemic. 1980, nobody had heard of drug-related HIV or AIDS, but by 1990, 250,000 Americans were infected with a deadly disease for which we had no cure. In 1980, you had about 50,000 people locked up on drug charges. By 1990, it was 250,000 on its way to 500,000. 1980, federal and state governments were spending a couple $2 billion a year on the drug war. By 1990, it was something like $20 or $40 billion a year, draining resources from education and all sorts of other more positive ways that taxpayers can spend their money. So the notion that the key criteria of success or failure should be how many people say, yeah, I tried pot or used cocaine last year, as opposed to focusing on the real bottom line, which is how many people are dying of drugs. That's gone up fourfold over the last 20 or 30 years from overdoses. How many people are getting deadly diseases like HIV or Hep C? How many people are having their families destroyed by being sent to prison for a nonviolent offense? How much money is going down the drain in this sinkhole of a drug war? I think we need a new bottom line in this drug war, and the drug czar is not offering it.
Global Commission on drugs.org/report is where you can find the findings of this commission. We have highlighted some of the bigger findings on a still that we'll show you over our next call as far as what the commission found. This call comes from Atlanta, Georgia. Alvin, Democrats line. You're on with Ethan Nadelmann.
I think he hits a lot of great points on this matter. I just would like to say that, I think that this war on drugs is worse than the Madoff scandal, because I think everything that he said pretty much this morning, everybody around the world actually knows it. But as you mentioned earlier, this is a big business in America. Lawyers, judges, and so forth and so on are the only ones that are actually benefiting from this thing, and at the same time, it's causing us to really go bankrupt as a country. So I think that, for the most part, the handwriting is on the wall, and we see exactly what's going on.
Well, if I could just say to that, I run the Drug Policy Alliance. We're the leading national organization promoting alternatives to the war on drugs. And we represent everybody from the people who want to legalize all drugs to the people who are not comfortable quite legalizing anything but think we should deal with addiction much more as a health issue and stop locking up so many people. But one of the things we did a few years ago is worked with people in California to put a ballot initiative, for the California voters in 2008. It would have reduced incarceration by about 25,000 nonviolent offenders. It would have shifted $1 billion a year from prison and parole to treatment and rehabilitation. It would have held the whole prison system accountable to a new set of standards. The polling when we started was 2-1 in favor of doing this. And then what happened? The prison guards union, right? The folks whose interest it is to keep the prisons full, they started campaigning against this thing. They called in the whole political hierarchy, both Democrats and Republicans, from Jerry Brown and Dianne Feinstein to people on the Republican side, and they landed up swamping this initiative. They raised money from the alcohol industry. They raised money from the casinos. They raised money. I mean, it was a sordid enterprise. And what you saw was this prison industrial complex sort of rearing its ugly head to defend its own narrow interests. What kind of society is it where the people whose jobs depend upon locking up their fellow citizens at rates that no other country locks up their fellow citizens have more political power than any other lobby in a state legislature? That's something that America can be ashamed of, and it's something that needs to change.
Republican line from Littlefield, Texas. Anthony, good morning.
Yes, sir.
How
are you doing?
You're on. Go ahead.
I got a plan that bail out the old government, the bank exchange.
We're talking about the global drug war, sir. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think drugs should be legalized. What the hell are we telling our children when we're around doing drugs? Can't go to work, can't do, sitting there stone half out of your mind. What are we telling our children?
Mr. Nadelmann.
Well, I'll tell you the answer to that. I don't need the government telling my children anything, quite frankly. Thank you very much. I think any decent parent should be able to bring up their own kids without the government having to tell them which drugs they should or shouldn't use. I think, we don't want our kids using alcohol or cigarettes, but we don't need the government locking people in bars and spending tens of billions of dollars of our money in order to do that. We don't want our kids lying and cheating and all sorts of other things, but we don't need a government making it a criminal law to do so. What we need is parents asserting responsible parenthood. What we need schools is acting intelligently and providing honest drug education. And I want the government spending our money on keeping us safe. I want the government spending our money going after violent criminals and people who steal. I want the government spending our money on quality health care and quality education. I want our government investing taxpayer resources in ways that actually help build this country rather than build a bigger prison industrial complex. So quite frankly, I don't think America is going to go to Sodom and Gomorrah if drugs become decriminalized or legalized. I think maybe more people will use drugs, but I think that the total result, the total number of drug problems in America will actually decline. We'll be a safer, healthier country if we move in that direction.
San Clemente, California, on our Democrats line. Joy.
Good morning. I couldn't have said it better what he just got done saying. I am a 52-year-old grandmother, and I have had 2 first cousins die of alcohol-related accidents. Fortunately, they didn't kill anybody else. Alcohol to me is the worst drug out there. It is the most unpredictable drug. I grew up in Laguna Beach, and kind of went through my own. I smoked a lot of pot. I did a little cocaine, and I have a 24-year-old daughter right now, and I told her I would rather have her have 5 joints hanging out of her mouth driving than 1 beer. And I am all for legalizing marijuana. It's not a gateway drug. I am just
We'll leave it there, caller. Thanks.
Well, I'll tell us 2 things to that. The first one is, she makes a very good point. The Global Commission on Drug Policy, one of the things they did in their report is they showed the way that drugs are handled in the sort of global drug control regime, and then they showed how scientists assess the relative risks of these drugs. And what they show is that there is essentially no relationship between them. In other words, alcohol and cigarettes, right? Those are 2 legal drugs. Most scientists would sort of rank them very high up in terms of their relative danger, certainly more so than marijuana, and in some respects more so than heroin. Heroin addicts routinely say it's tougher to quit cigarettes than it is heroin, and the fact of the matter is, smoking cigarettes is causing millions of cancer deaths around the world. Heroin can be a very addictive drug, but if you have a legal supply, as they're now doing with addicts in Europe and Canada, well then in fact you can actually, I'm not recommending this, but you can actually remain on heroin and live a long life. It does not destroy your bodily organs. And it's not like alcohol, cigarettes, or cocaine for that matter. The second thing I want to say is that the argument for changing the way we deal with drugs and reducing our reliance on the criminal justice system, this is not just an argument being made by people like on the Global Commission who don't use drugs. It's not just an argument being made by people who like to smoke pot, which is true of many Americans who smoke marijuana and don't do harm to anybody else. This is also an argument being made by people who have seen the worst that drugs can do, who have grown up in families where addiction is rampant, who have lost children to overdoses and lost children to HIV, who have grown up with alcoholic or drug-addicting parents, and they see how terrible drugs are, but they understand that the war on drugs, criminalization in prison, is not the way to deal with drugs. There's a wonderful new organization that's emerged in California called Mothers United Against the War on Drugs. Now, these are largely mothers and fathers who, whose kids are struggling with addiction. Some have lost their children to drug addiction. But they're coming out and saying, as terrible as drugs have been, as bad as we can see it, that dealing with it through the criminal justice system has only made things worse. It's only made it more likely that our kids will die or land up dead of an overdose. It's only made it more likely they'll end up in jail and prison and be victimized by people behind bars. So let's understand. This debate is not about your experience with drugs, good, bad, or indifferent. This is about recognizing that the criminal justice approach, the prohibitionist approach, is the wrong way to deal with this stuff. That we should deal with addiction as a health issue. We should hold people responsible if they hurt other people or get behind the wheel of a car under the influence of drugs. And that for those people who use drugs and do no harm to others, leave them alone.
Do you reject the notion of a gateway drug of type?
Well, it's not just me who, by and large, rejects the gateway drug. It's also the National Academy of Science, which is the leading scientific advisory board in the United States. I mean, I would basically say that the gateway theory with respect to marijuana is an ounce of truth embedded in a pound of bull. On the one hand, the vast majority of people who use cocaine or heroin or get in trouble with drugs did use marijuana beforehand. And for that matter, they also used alcohol and cigarettes and a range of other things before as well. On the other hand, the vast majority of people who have used marijuana, and keep in mind that's now well over 100 million Americans, it includes the last 3 occupants of the White House, it includes members of the U.S. Supreme Court, it includes many of the most successful businessmen and intellectuals and other officials around, around the United States, around the world. The vast majority of those people never went on to use cocaine or heroin, never went on to get in trouble with other drugs, never went on even to become regular marijuana users or get in trouble with marijuana. So the notion that somehow we can try to reduce heroin addiction in America by cracking down on, 20-year-olds smoking marijuana is like trying to say that we can reduce motorcycle fatalities by trying to deter bicycle riding.
Boston, Massachusetts, you are next for Ethan Nadelmann.
Yes, Ethan, this is, I have a couple of comments. One is the system we have now in place is not working at all. In California, I know they have legalized medical marijuana, and I think that eventually will sweep the country. I also want to say that responsibility is what we should be teaching our children. If we, if we teach them that the drugs are bad and they can have bad effects on them, we'll teach them to be responsible, to choose wisely what they choose to smoke or drink or whatever. So those are my 2 comments.
Mr. Nadelmann.
Well, I appreciate your comments. Marijuana is now legal for medical purposes in 16 states and will be shortly in Washington, D.C. I and my organization have played a very key role in over half of those states deciding to legalize medical marijuana. And the states vary greatly, from California, where the law is very open-ended and it's very easy to get a legal recommendation for marijuana, to states like Maine and New Mexico and New Jersey and elsewhere, where it's actually a fairly restrictive system where doctors will only give a recommendation for a limited number of conditions. So there's very different models around the country. I'll tell you that one of the biggest problems has been in Washington. So I certainly would encourage the listeners to this show to write your member of Congress and say it's time for the federal government to sort of get out of the way and allow states to legally and responsibly regulate marijuana for medical purposes. There were 3 medical marijuana bills just introduced recently, good bills by Congressman Barney Frank, Congressman Jared Polis from Boulder, Colorado, and Congressman Pete Stark from California. People should be supporting those bills. Meanwhile, Attorney General Eric Holder was in Rhode Island last week. It's another state that's legalized medical marijuana. He was asked, why is the Justice Department, after giving the word to say that they'll respect what the states are doing, now begin to crack down? And he said, look, we're trying to figure this out. So I'd also encourage people to contact the Justice Department and say, play a responsible role in regulating this rather than blindly enforcing federal law. Over 2/3 of Americans now believe that marijuana should be legal for medical purposes. Even in the South, even in states like Alabama, over 50% of people say marijuana should be legal for medical purposes. And last year, a bill to legalize medical marijuana went through the State Judiciary Committee. So it's a shame that with such a huge majority of Americans saying this is the way to go, that we still only have 16 states where it's legal and Congress is still unable to act. But I think with enough pressure from citizens, we will see this country make marijuana legal for medical purposes surely, and eventually for other uses as well.
Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on our Republican line. Wendy, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I've personally been robbed, kidnapped and robbed. I do not have any possessions. I got rid of my house. I sold my home. Everyone I've met down here is doing, lots of people here in Fort Lauderdale are doing drugs. People come here to get the drugs. I feel as though I can't purchase jewelry. I don't wear jewelry. Everything's locked away in the bank. And also, if they can't get the drug, once they start doing drugs, I've seen tons of people, they go down the drain. And when they want the drug, they're addicted, they will rob you. So what do you have to say about that? And also, I want to ask you a question. Why don't we legalize one state so all the scumbags go to that, because I think they are scumbags. I think people who do drugs have problems, and we need to isolate them, put them in one state, legalize all drugs so they all go to one place, and we can all live in peace. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, interesting points you make. I mean, I think it really is a mistake to call 120 million Americans scumbags because they might have used drugs once or twice. I mean, I just think that's, you know, there's a lot of things you can call people, but that's not the way to do it. You know, people who use drugs are no different than people who use alcohol or pharmaceutical drugs or cigarettes or you name it. So let's not condemn people simply for what they put in their body. Let's make our moral judgments about our fellow human beings, not based upon what they put in their body, but how they treat their fellow citizens. Secondly, I think you end up actually making a very powerful argument in favor of legalization. The people who are mugging you or are taking property or stealing, they're not doing to support their cigarette habit. Now, mind you, if we keep heading down the road we seem to be heading and we land up criminalizing cigarettes, we'll probably have fewer cigarette smokers, but the pack of a price of cigarettes will go from $8 or $10 to $50 or $100. Then you and people you live around will start getting mugged by cigarette addicts. If we make alcohol illegal and the price jumps tenfold, then we'll see people starting to get mugged by alcohol addicts. I'll tell you something, if we criminalized coffee, within a few years, you'd see people beginning to mug people to support their coffee habit. Now, on the other hand, if you legalize some of the drugs that are now illegal, if people could get heroin, for example, from legal sources, from legal outlets, and mind you, heroin becomes morphine in the human body. Heroin's basically an opiate drug, a pain-killing drug. It gets all the sensationalist attention, but it's not that different than what millions of Americans are taking in hospitals and at their home. If that drug were legally available, heroin addicts could get their stuff from a pharmacy, the way they sometimes can do it not from a pharmacy but from a clinic in Europe. They would not be mugging anybody anymore. So let's understand what leads people oftentimes to sort of mug people and commit crimes to support their habits. It's not the drugs, because the drugs that are illegal are oftentimes no more deadly or dangerous than the drugs that are illegal. It's their criminalization which lands up increasing their price by 5, 10, 20, and 30-fold, putting the money into the hands of criminals and obliging those people who are addicted to go out and support their habit one way or another. So I think whether you intended it or not, you landed up making one of the most powerful arguments for drug legalization.
Ethan Nadelmann is the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Drugpolicy.org is the website if you wish to find out more. West Palm Beach, Florida, Democrats line. Rick.
I just wanted to tell you that we fought wars, and we are fighting a war right now. And Afghanistan is the poppy plant of the world. Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, all CIA operations. This is big business, and you can't really, I really don't think a man should be put in jail for smoking a joint, but there is a difference between crack cocaine and heroin and all that other stuff. There should be limitations.
Thank you, caller.
Well, I mean, as I said before, it is true. There's evidence that the CIA was involved with the heroin business in Southeast Asia during the 60s and 70s, in Afghanistan during the 80s and 90s, in Central America and South America and other decades as well. In every case, it wasn't because the CIA wanted to be involved in that sense. It was mostly because the people that we were working with in those countries, whether it was the folks fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan or fighting the Viet Cong in Southeast Asia, were people who were very good at fighting our enemies, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but also people who were supporting what they were doing through the sale of drugs. So the CIA kind of turned a blind eye to this sorts of thing. Now that said, and as I said before, even if the CIA had been squeaky clean, those drugs still would have landed up in the United States. People looked at the CIA involved in Nicaragua in the 80s, and that's how crack cocaine got to L.A. Well, there's an element of truth to that, but if the CIA had never been involved, crack cocaine probably would have shown up a few weeks or a few months later. These are global commodities markets. That's the way it is. I think beyond that, you make a legitimate point. Drugs need to be treated differently. Marijuana, although people can get addicted to it, marijuana is a drug. You should not use it if you're a youngster. You should not get behind the wheel of a car and drive. You should not use it if you have mental illness running through your family. Nonetheless, for most people, marijuana is relatively less dangerous than the vast majority of other drugs. Nobody's ever died of a marijuana overdose. Most people don't get addicted to it, and those who do oftentimes can get that addiction behind them more readily than with other drugs. With a drug like heroin, let's look at the science. Now, in Germany, the Netherlands, in England, in Denmark, in Switzerland, and until recently in Canada as well, people who have been addicted to street heroin and who were not able to quit through a 12-step program, a drug-free program, who went to jail or prison, who got methadone or buprenorphine, the substitution drugs, what the government decided to do was to set up different clinics where these people could come to the clinic and get heroin legally, pharmaceutically produced heroin. Now, what happened, of course, was that people landed up not using more heroin but less. People landed up no longer being arrested. People started reducing their other illicit drug use. They landed up starting to be able to get drugs. They get jobs and to get housing. They did not become zombies. Because once you've been using heroin for many years, you're not nodding out all the time. It's not like getting drunk all the time. You're basically taking something into your body to keep from getting sick. One of the other interesting things they found, they did a little experiment, what's called a double-blind experiment, with neither the people taking the drug or the people giving it to them knew what they were getting. And they gave half the people pharmaceutical heroin, and the other half they gave the drug Dilaudid. Now, Dilaudid is a drug that millions of Americans have taken in hospitals or home for pain. It turned out that long-term heroin addicts could not tell the difference between heroin and Dilaudid. Now, what does that mean? It means if we could snap our fingers tomorrow and all the heroin in the world were to be replaced with this pharmaceutical drug, Dilaudid, nobody would know the difference. And it means that if we snapped our fingers and all the people in American hospitals were being given heroin instead of Dilaudid, nobody would know the difference, that you basically cannot tell the drugs apart.
Mr. Nadelmann,
so let's understand.
We've run out of time.
Yes, I was just going to say, well, okay, Pedro, thank you very much. I think the point was clear.
But you're with the Drug Policy Alliance. You serve as the executive director, drugpolicy.org, the website, if you wish to find out more about the guests and the organization. Mr. Nadelmann, we do appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Pedro. The pleasure to be on.
Wiretaps on your phone, what have you done? In the privacy of your own home, what have you done? Our records reveal you've been having too much fun, and that ain't right in the new world, right? Or in a drug war, because that's what we've been calling it, a drug war. Cause everyone's a commie in a drug war, and we've been running low on commies since the Cold War. So that's what we're calling it now. Well, your high school chum went bump in the night. What has he done? For 20 years in the represent light, what has he done? 20 Z's in Dallas and he was not white. Is that all that counts? 1 year, 1 ounce in a drug war. Because that's what we've been calling it, a drug war. Cause everyone's a commie in a drug war. And we've been running low on commies since the Cold War. Yeah, but everyone's a commie in a drug war. And everyone's a dealer in a drug war. So that's what we're calling it now. Drug war practice. You can step drug war. With this drug war by digging up Joe McCarthy of the Cold War to beat the prison bloody in this drug war. But all the good doctors' hands are tied by the drug war as all the bad barristers decide it's a drug war. And which branch shall be their popping in a drug war? But you know that hemp could replace heroin if it weren't for all the jail cells they're filling in the drug war. But prisons make a killing, and that's the real reason for the drug war. Cause everyone's a commie, we can enlist them at their army. so you can incarcerate your mommy. I hope that no one saw me. Yeah, I hope that no one saw me.
Now, when it comes to medical marijuana, I have more of a practical view than anything else. I mean, my attitude is that if it's an issue of doctors prescribing medical marijuana as a treatment for glaucoma or as a cancer treatment, I think that should be appropriate, because there really is no difference between that and a doctor prescribing morphine or anything else. I think there are legitimate concerns in not wanting to allow people to grow their own or start setting up mom and pop shops, because at that point it becomes fairly difficult to regulate. And you know, again, I'm not familiar with all the details of the initiative that was passed and what safeguards there were in place, but I think the basic concept that using medical marijuana in the same way with the same controls as other drugs prescribed by doctors, I think that's entirely appropriate.
Hi, I'm Montel Williams. Most of you know me as a talk show host, but I'm also an author, actor, single father of 4, a fitness writer, avid snowboarder, and I'm also a medical marijuana patient. Like many of the million people who are living with multiple sclerosis, I'm in pain every single day. And sometimes my nerves are so raw that if you brushed up against me in an elevator, I'd scream. I can't sleep at night from the pain, and sometimes the spasms in my legs are so intense they will wake me up throughout the night. I've tried the strongest prescription medications available, and I'm going to tell you, they do not work. And in fact, they leave me in a stupor, and most of the time, it's impossible to even live your life. Now, I've tried medical marijuana, and I'm going to tell you something, it works. If you'd like more information about medical marijuana, you can contact the Marijuana Policy Project at mpp.org or call 1-877-JOIN-MPP.
The global war on drugs has failed. That's according to a commission that includes former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz. A report released by the Global Commission on Drug Policy on Thursday calls for the legalization of marijuana and other controlled substances. Our principles and recommendations can be summarized as follows. End the criminalization, marginalization, and stigmatization of people who use drugs but who do no harm to others. The Commission is especially critical of the anti-drug policies applied by the United States, saying the U.S. government should adopt policies rooted in health care and human rights rather than anti-crime approaches. The Commission says the global scale of illegal drug markets has grown dramatically over the last decade, but the U.S. argues the war on drugs has been effective domestically.
The United Nations will release a report today showing that the use of opiates, cocaine, and marijuana from 1998 to 2008 has increased substantially. The panel recommends making drugs legal and offer treatment services for users. The White House says drug use in the U.S. is down, with cocaine use declining almost 50% in the past 5 years.
The United States government has rejected the findings as misguided.
The U.S. has taken a really hard line when it comes to drugs, and essentially their argument is it would be a huge mistake to legalize drugs because in the end more people would use it, the argument goes, and it would actually create a much more harmful situation. They say too that the focus really needs to be on reducing demand. There are numbers out there to prove that when it's done effectively, they can do it properly and successfully, but legalizing drugs for now for the U.S., no way, Jose.
Bruce Bagley, expert on drug trafficking in Latin America at the University of Miami, compared U.S. efforts to a massive game of whack-a-mole in which drug supplies, drug violence, and crime are shuffled from one country to the other. In the U.S., there is little or nothing to show for it except for the warehousing of some 600,000 people a year on drug-related offenses in prison at huge costs. The Commission's recommendations were a good start, but unlikely to be implemented given political and public resistance to such ideas in the U.S. A blogger for The Telegraph said, according to the evidence presented in the report, regulation of drugs is better than prohibition. Generally, in a liberal democracy, you need a reason to make things illegal, not a reason to legalize them. There is, it seems, no good reason not to take a long, hard look at our drug policy, at what really works, not what is merely politically expedient. The 19-member commission also included former U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, the former presidents of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, writers Carlos Fuentes and Maria Vargas Llosa, and British business mogul Richard Branson. Download the Newsy Android app for free from the Android market today. And for Newsy, I'm Jennifer Meckles. Multiple sources, the real story.
To Washington, D.C., Juan Carlos Hidalgo is with the Cato Institute, a public policy research organization. Let's pick it up from that idea that some countries are articulating, at least, that some drugs should be legalized. The U.S. says no, because it would make drugs more readily available. What would make the problem less acute in Latin America, where it is at its most serious?
Indeed, the report denounces what it calls imperialism of drug control imposed by the U.S. in particular on other countries, especially in Latin America, where the prohibitionist approach has prevailed, and that has led to a lot of problems in the region. We see Mexico, for example, where drug violence is costing the lives of 35,000 people so far since President Felipe Calderón came to power and announced a war on drug cartels. But we also see it in Central America, where these Mexican drug cartels are growing in power and influence. We see it in the Andean region, in how drug production has fueled terrorist groups like the FARC guerrilla in Colombia or the Shining Path in Peru. So I think that Latin American countries stand to benefit a lot from a different approach to drug policy like the one recommended by this committee.
Has that military approach that has been so encouraged, some would say even forced upon some of these countries like Colombia, like Mexico, by the U.S. administration, has it completely backfired? Has it only created more drugs and more violence?
There is a wealth of evidence, and is reviewed by the report of the Commission on Global Drug Policy, that shows that escalation in the war of drugs leads to more violence. We see in Mexico, the states where President Felipe Calderón has deployed the army have witnessed a dramatic rise in crime and violence and homicides as a result of bigger and more deadly encounters between the drug cartels and the army and among drug organizations. So obviously more of the same, more violence, more tightening of drug policy is not working in solving the problem of drug violence.
And do you think Latin America's drug problem can be solved as long as the U.S. continues to fuel the demand for drugs across the borders of some of these countries?
As long as the U.S. continues to endorse the prohibition policy that is now common around the world and the prohibition of drugs, we're going to see more of the same problems. The problem is not consumption per se, but the prohibition. Prohibition is what creates a black market, and this black market is conducted by criminal networks that rely on violence and corruption to get their business done. So if we want to see drug violence eradicated, we have to legalize drugs. That's one of the recommendations of this report.
Does it help, do you think, to frame the issue as a war on drugs instead of looking at it as a social health problem? The U.S., and we've been speaking to some U.S. officials, have been telling us that they think this report has been grossly mischaracterizing their approach, that they do not take the mentality of a war on drugs approach, that they take, quote, the approach of a treatment/education perspective to this. Do you agree with that?
No, not at all. Every year, more than 1 million people get arrested in the United States for consumption of drugs. That's not how you treat the people who are sick. That's how you treat criminals. And we see it in the United States. It's the country that has the most people in prison everywhere in the world, even more than totalitarian regimes like China. So definitely the approach in the United States has been an approach that has relied on enforcement, has relied on tough measures, it has relied on using the police and armed forces against the people who consume drugs. And that's why we see that many of these problems in other countries too, that have followed the leadership of the United States in drug policy, and they're paying even more dearer consequences.
But how do you assess the way the U.S. administration has been approaching this issue, not just under the previous administration, but under Barack Obama? If I can just quote from what Laura Carlson has recently written. She's the director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy. She says, the drug war has become the major vehicle of militarization in Latin America. It's a vehicle funded and driven by the U.S. government and fueled by a combination of false morals, hypocrisy, and a lot of cold, hard fear. The so-called war on drugs is really a war on people, especially youth, women, indigenous peoples, and dissidents.
I agree. The new drug czar appointed by President Obama said that he didn't like the term war on drugs. But if you look at the way that the Obama administration has been spending money on drug efforts, it's basically the same as previous administrations, relying heavily on drug enforcement and the use of police and military aid to other countries. And there is a lot of hypocrisy in this policy. As well as I mentioned before, you see that the people in Latin America, especially Mexico and Central America, are dying because of drug policy, whereas here in the United States we have the former Olympic champion Michael Phelps being caught smoking marijuana and nothing happens to him. Even President Obama has admitted himself that he consumed drugs when he was young.
Everybody worried about drugs today, telling our kids just what to say. Great big problem all through the land, gotta find ourselves a brand new plan. Put them in jail, just don't work, just ask my brother Solomon Burke. What we gotta do is in the profit, money is the key and we can stop it. All this killing and corruption couldn't be gone without using a gun, yeah. What we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Gotta put them pushes right in the grave. All this murder and all this crime, and since so many people died, making it illegal's only made it worse. It's like we got ourselves a great big curse. People think they're cool 'cause it's outlawed, thinking they rebel without a cause. We gotta help the sick and the addicted, but we're killing ourselves with the new prohibition. Not the government's job to tell you what to do. Decide for yourself what's right for you. If you go too far and you get out of hand, then you take a trip down to prison land. What we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Gotta put them pushes right in the grave. The war on drugs is gonna lose. Gotta take away the profit like we did with booze. Our people couldn't buy for 1/10 of the price. Wouldn't need to rob or use a knife. Gotta take the cash out of this illegal trade. Education and the laws will say always been people addicted to drugs are heroin, cocaine, evil thugs. Just because some people can't handle anything doesn't mean we have to pay for their pain. Nicotine, caffeine, chainsaws and guns. Gotta make your own regulations. Psychedelic mushrooms, good for your mind. If you're ready to use them, yeah, you ought to try them. Have the freedom to mess up your own life. Decide for yourself what's wrong and what's right. What we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Gotta put them pushes right in the grave. What we gotta do? Legalize. Yeah, what we gotta do? Legalize. Oh, what we gotta do? Legalize. Gotta put them pushes right in the grave.
On the program today, my joint host and I, Paul Stanford, we were talking about the DEA and their little list and the way they like to intimidate people. Paul, what do you think about that anyway? Isn't that kind of rude, putting people's names out there and calling them tricksters and liars?
I don't know if it's, I'm sure they didn't mean well by it, and by them I mean the DEA, but to me that's a list of heroes. People who are must be doing something good.
Yeah, exactly why I was annoyed that I wasn't included on that list.
I know. I wasn't too bothered by it not being included, but I guess we do have, you said number 4 on the list on the show today.
Yeah, well, he's joining us here in a minute at the studio, still getting him on, and that gives us an opportunity to find out more about what we're talking about on total relegalization there in Oregon.
Now, does that mean just for everything, recreational?
Yeah,
growing,
yeah. It would allow people to grow their own. Our bill, which is OCTA, or the Oregon Cannabis Tax Act, would allow people to grow their own and allow the government to license commercial growers. We tried to pattern it on some regulations that were embodied in the Single Convention Treaty and try to fashion a bill that will withstand federal scrutiny. While there's no guarantee that it will do so, we think we've drafted a bill that makes it a stronger case for being upheld in federal court and complying with international treaty obligations than any other proposal or model out there. So it would allow industrial hemp to be cultivated without regulation as well. In fact, 2% of the profits from the sales of marijuana to adults, the taxes on that would go to promote industrial hemp crops for fiber, fuel, and food here in Oregon. So we're pretty excited about that. We have some polling showing that we can win. We've done $10,000 worth of polls in 2 different polls over the past 18 months and used some of the information that we were able to gather in that to redraft the bill to make it stronger at the ballot box. So we're going for the ballot in November of 2012. We have until July of 2012 to gather signatures. We have a longer period to gather signatures in Oregon than any other state.
Excellent. Well, let's hope it happens. It's my understanding that we have now been joined by one of our heroes, Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan, thank you for taking time for hemp.
Sure. Good to be on, Casper.
Good to hear from you.
Well, I tell you, you are a real hero. Before we get into what you're doing, I think you remember I sent you a notice a while back that the DEA has actually posted a memo on the front of their website, and they've listed you in it, and they've listed you under the legalization lobby as one of the people who is trying to say that marijuana is quote-unquote medicine, and actually it is just false trickery being used by you, along with the Marijuana Policy Project, Ed Rosenthal, and a few billionaires like George Soros. And they quote you in 2000 in the New York Times as saying, when asked about medical marijuana being an issue, is it a stalking horse for drug relegalization? You stated, will it help lead towards marijuana legalization? I hope so. So apparently you've been called out by the DEA on their front homepage. How does that make you feel, Ethan?
You know, I'll tell you, it's interesting because even as the drug czar's office gets a little more nuanced in their messaging and other parts of the White House and such, the DEA still seems a bit stuck in that old kind of hyper rhetoric of the late 80s and the 1990s. I was at an event conference in El Paso, Texas last year, and there was some high-level guy from DEA up there, and it was like he was pulling out the same demon weed marijuana stuff slides, you know, that had been discredited a long time ago. And I think one of the great tragedies of the DEA is that, you know, it's reasonable. Those guys get paid to enforce the laws, and I can't blame them if they're doing their operations to try to enforce federal laws. That's what the job is. That's what the law is. But when they cross the line, and when they start to become advocates for those laws themselves and for toughening those laws, when they start to become politically minded critics of people who call for reforming those laws, I think they're really crossing a line, and I have to try to figure out, or I hope somebody can figure out, how better to call them out on that. Because
that's violating the Hatch Act, isn't it? The Hatch Act says non-elected public officials can't be involved in partisan political activity.
Well, you know, it's not partisan, right? It's not Democrat, Republican. It doesn't involve people running for office, so they're not allowed to do that. But on the other hand, you know, this notion of going after or criticizing, and oftentimes doing it dishonestly and not based upon any real facts in a distorted way, you know, I mean, that does seem to cross a bit of a line. I mean, why these guys should become, you know, outright promoters of the laws they enforce and defenders of those, that doesn't seem like it should be part of the job description. So it's, I don't know what to tell you about it, Casper. It's funny, when I first got involved in this area back in the 1980s, initially, before I was an advocate, I was doing research on this. So I actually worked in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau for about 9 months. I wrote a classified report on money laundering, and I interviewed drug enforcement agents all around the world. So I got to know a lot of those guys. And, I got to respect some of them. I got to see through some of them. They're a mixed bunch like any place else. But this political side of the agency, which also manifests in the politically minded decisions they make about, allowing medical marijuana, to be provided by sources other than the government's marijuana farm or the scheduling of drugs. There's a political side to this agency which needs to be more harshly criticized, and I think we need a better strategy to do that with.
I thought I was really surprised to see that you had been listed like that. Paul, you got a question? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, what activities is the Drug Policy Alliance looking forward to over the next 2 years to try to forward the cause?
Well, for DPA, marijuana reform is probably right now the number one thing we're working on, but it's only a portion of our overall agenda. We're deeply involved on sentencing reform with a whole range of drugs. We were very involved in reforming the crack powder penalties in Congress this year, the Rockefeller drug law reform in New York the year before, and we've been very involved with harm reduction, trying to prevent overdose fatalities and spread of HIV/AIDS. But marijuana reform has been the really big thing. I'd say that looking forward to the next year, Casper and Paul, what I would say is that on the marijuana front, I'd say the key things, right now I'm in California and just came from a little meeting trying to think through what a ballot initiative in 2012, what changes would be made from the 2010 initiative. And there was some research presented, a lot of good thinking by people who've been involved in this, trying to think through, because California, it looks like the polling, Prop 19 got 46.5% of the vote. If young people had showed up the way they tend to show up in a presidential election year, it might have gotten something more like 49 to 50%. There's a demographic trend that's in our favor. We were lucky that there was no major opposition funding, and that's always a risk for 2 years down the road. But I think California is going to be a major priority. We're also looking at a ballot initiative in Colorado where the polling is looking somewhat promising as well, and where there's good local activists there working on putting something together. And then I'll tell you, elsewhere around the country, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Nevada, or other states where the numbers are beginning to look good. I'm not sure what DPA's role is going to be in those places. We're also deeply involved on the medical marijuana implementation. We just fought and won a pretty significant struggle in New Mexico to increase by 50% both the number of dispensaries and the number of plants that could be growing. We got Governor Richardson to approve that shortly before he left office, and we're going to be fighting against the new Governor Martinez, who's going to try to roll back medical marijuana. We're deeply involved in the implementation of medical marijuana in New Jersey. We've been involved in Maine. Those are priorities. We're working with folks in Connecticut on medical marijuana legislation. We're hoping to introduce a marijuana legalization bill in New York State sometime this year, although it's tricky because there's a medical marijuana bill that's still in play. And we've been helping on the marijuana issue, both broader legalization and decrim and medical in a wide range of other states. Always looking for where's the best opportunity to move the ball forward, both on the specific issue and the general issue. And then more broadly, we're deeply involved on sentencing reform, trying to, look, Congress is going to be tough because with the Republicans taking over the House, we're going to have to play some defense. They may try to roll back the legalization of federal funding for needle exchange. They may try to roll back the Washington, D.C. setting up medical marijuana. So we'll have to play some defense. But we also want to play some offense on a campaign essentially to, quote-unquote, starve the drug war. And we see an opportunity here to build alliances between drug reformers among the Democrats and some of the, fiscally conservative or libertarian Republicans who are not supporters of some of this ludicrous federal funding for the drug war. So that's going to be a major initiative in Washington, D.C. for us this coming year. And then there's just a whole host of other bills. A lot, the overdose issue doesn't involve marijuana, obviously, but, overdose fatalities is now the number 2 leading cause of death, of accidental death after car accidents in America. It's the number 1 leading cause of death among certain age groups. So we're deeply involved in promoting Good Samaritan legislation and an antidote drug called naloxone that could really cut overdose fatalities in a major way. So that's a portion of what we're doing, and there's a lot more.
Now, I haven't had a chance to put this on your table. I've mentioned it before to a couple other guests. What I don't understand is everybody who studies the war on drugs and understands prohibition realizes that these laws were put in place to keep down the black minorities and the Hispanic minorities back in the early 1900s. And so I'm thinking we got a black president and a black drug czar. Gee, wouldn't they be quick to turn around those laws that were put in place by white men deliberately to keep the minorities down?
On the one hand, I would give Obama some credit because, when he was running for office, he made 3 explicit commitments. He said he would support federal funding for needle exchange to reduce AIDS. He said he'd pull the federal government back on the whole medical marijuana thing, and he said he would try to change these crack powder mandatory minimum drug laws. And I'll tell you, he more or less delivered to some good extent on all 3. I mean, he didn't lead the effort to allow federal funding on needle exchange, but he signed the bill. And when it came to medical marijuana, that Holder memorandum in 2009 that basically says that the feds would not go after medical marijuana in those states where state authorities said it was legal, that's made a huge difference, especially in places like Colorado, Montana, and a range of other places where it's really opened up the ability to open up dispensaries, and it's provided a greater opportunity to try to legalize medical marijuana in other states. And the third thing, on reforming the crack powder laws, I mean, he and Holder both made clear they wanted to eliminate that 100-to-1 disparity, and Holder said both publicly and privately that this was a legacy issue for him. And the fact is that those guys got in there. I mean, they pushed hard for 1-to-1. I think they leaned in against that. There was a successful building of a bipartisan coalition with Senator Dick Durbin leading on one hand, but some prominent Republicans on the other hand. And even though we didn't get the full repeal, they just reduced it from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. It was a significant victory, and it did reflect Obama making good on his commitment. So that's the good stuff. On the other hand, the continuing, it's so disappointing with the drug czar Kurlikowski. Because, he used to be police chief of Seattle. He's smart enough to know better. He was the police chief of, Seattle, where you got Hemp Fest, the biggest, pro-marijuana gathering in the world. He did actually pay a visit when he was police chief up to Vancouver and visited the supervised injection facility up there and wrote a fairly neutral report about it. So he's a smart, sensible guy, but his read on the politics, he has been saying the most ludicrous stuff about marijuana. And, you see this growing sentiment outside the United States to open up a more serious and vigorous debate that includes discussion of various legal regulatory options. And he's just not present. And the rhetoric that's coming out of there, it's not quite as bad as the DEA stuff, but it's not sophisticated, it's not nuanced, it's not a step forward. You see on the medical marijuana stuff, he just keeps, he's just doing the least amount that he needs to do politically, and all the rest is kind of hostile. And then when it comes to trying to follow in the footsteps, the Europeans, the Canadians are allowing the opening of heroin maintenance programs for heroin addicts who can't quit. No discussion, all being shut down in the U.S. So you still have the politicization of scientific research. You still have this incredible trepidation about a really opening dialogue. And you don't see Obama or anybody speaking to the embarrassment, the absurdity of America having the highest rate of incarceration in the world. I mean, the fact that our rates of nonviolent crime and drug use are not that much different than a lot of other countries, but we're locking up people at 4, 5, 6, 7 times the rates of other countries and locking up African Americans at rates that exceed the rates of incarceration in the Soviet gulags. There's a failure of leadership on the part, I think, of the administration.
Well, that, and there's also like the Mexican presidents, all of them, are like almost begging us to end the war on marijuana and drugs so that the war in their country can stop.
Well, exactly. I mean, you have the former President Fox, who's explicitly calling for legalization. You have the current President Calderon, who's opposed to legalization, but saying, yes, he agrees there needs to be a debate. And you have their predecessors, President Zedillo, who teamed up with the former Brazilian President Cardoso and the former Colombian President Gaviria for this very prominent and important Latin American commission that called for moving the direction of decriminalization, that pointed out the harms of prohibition in Latin America, and that demanded that, all options be on the table, that we need to break the taboo on open discussion of all drug policy options. So there's
Okay,
a global
Ethan,
discussion that's bubbling now. You know?
We've only got about 30 seconds before we have to say goodbye to you. I'm sorry we couldn't keep you longer. We want to have you come back.
Yeah. Thank you
All
so
right.
much for having me on.
Thank you for being a guest. We'll have you back as soon as your schedule allows here at Time for Hemp.
Some very powerful people are suggesting it's time for the U.S. to rethink the war on drugs. CNN's Lisa Sylvester is back here with an in-depth look. Lisa?
Wolf, you know, it has been 40 years since President Nixon declared a war on drugs. Now a high-profile panel says that war is unwinnable and that it's time to look at other strategies, including legalizing drugs.
Use of opiates up 34.5%, cocaine use up 27%, and marijuana use up 8.5%. That's according to UN data cited in a new report of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. The commission bluntly says the global war on drugs has been a failure and says it's time for countries to change their policies. Commission member and CEO of Virgin Atlantic, Richard Branson.
Personally, I don't think the United States can afford to keep the drug policy as it is. It's costing them more and more every year to achieve something which you know, where they're just not winning. I mean, they're just not achieving anything.
The commission is made up of heavy hitters, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Paul Volcker, and various former Latin American presidents. They urge, quote, to end the criminalization, marginalization, and stigmatization of people who use drugs but do no harm to others. And they recommend governments experiment with models of legalizing drugs to reduce the power and influence of drug cartels.
Most European countries have tried different policies. They don't consider anymore consumption of drugs a crime. They consider that it's a problem of the health system. They have opened their health system to people so people can go and try to find solutions to their problem.
A spokesman for Hazelden that operates treatment centers for drug and alcohol addictions agrees the war on drugs has been a failure and applauds the report's conclusion for treating drug use as a health issue. But the group strongly opposes legalizing drugs.
I can speak professionally as somebody who works for the Hazelden Foundation, but I also know in my personal life that whatever the drug of choice is, when you put that into the mind and into the body of an addict or an alcoholic like me, they lose the power of making the right choices.
The White House Office of National Drug Control Policy did not make anyone available for an interview, but in a statement said, quote, the bottom line is that balanced drug control efforts are making a big difference. Today, drug use in America is half of what it was 30 years ago. Cocaine production in Colombia has dropped by almost 2/3, and we're successfully diverting thousands of nonviolent offenders into treatment instead of jail by supporting alternatives to incarceration.
Now, the White House says drug czar Gil Kerlikowske has been talking about for some time wanting to move away from the language of a war on drugs. Instead, he wants to focus on reducing drug use by 15% over the next 5 years. Well,
It's a tough issue. I've been watching it for 40 years, as we say, and doesn't seem to be making any progress whatsoever.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spent. Take another look and spend some time for him. Don't cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment.